Hey friends, it's Sarah, and today I want to recommend you some books by Indigenous authors for the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. So I did a video like this last year, and you can check it out for other book recommendations if you would like. I'll link it up top and down below. So September 30th is the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, which is a federal holiday in Canada that started 2 years ago in 2021, so very new, with the aim to commemorate the survivors as well as those who didn't survive the residential school system in Canada. So from 1867, which was the founding of Canada as we know it today, to 1996, which was the year I was born, there were 140 federally run residential schools in Canada. These schools were horrifying places with the goal of taking Indigenous children away from their families, stripping them of their culture and language. They were trying to basically commit a cultural genocide against the Indigenous peoples of Canada. So we have the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation to kind of reflect on that past and honor the people who managed to survive the residential schools and their families and those who didn't make it back. It was one of the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was a group that was formed from 2008 to 2015 to figure out ways for Canada and Indigenous people to reconcile. They ended up coming up with 94 calls to action. One of them was to have a federally mandated day of commemoration, which is the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. It also lands on the Orange Shirt Day, which is an Indigenous-led grassroots movement kind of centered around this story from Phyllis Webstad, who's one of the founding members. She was taken to a residential school and her grandmother had bought her a nice new orange shirt for her first day of school, and that was taken from her. So it kind of symbolizes the stripping away of culture and community from Indigenous children that the residential schools did. Kind of the idea of Orange Shirt Day, the motto more or less is every child matters. So, again, thinking of the survivors and those who didn't survive residential schools and the intergenerational trauma that has created and the lasting effects that we are still seeing, because like I said, the last one closed the year I was born. So it's only been 27 years that we haven't had residential schools, which is wild. That's just a little bit of background around the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. If you want to learn more, I'll put a couple links down below. And then of course, some of the books that I have will talk a little bit more about residential schools and stuff, so those are good resources to check out as well. First up, I have Namwayut by Chief Robert Joseph, and this is actually a word that means we are all one. This is a nonfiction book and sort of a memoir a little bit, because it does tell Chief Robert Joseph's story of going to residential school and how that affected his life, how it led him into alcoholism, and all of the effects it had on his family and his children and his wife later on in his life. He is the hereditary chief of the Wagamese people, and he's done a lot of work around residential schools. He was part of the Residential School Survivor Society, and he went around the country helping gather stories from survivors. This was a very touching story, obviously pretty upsetting what he had to go through, but throughout the whole thing is this idea we are all one, that the way to get past and to move through these tragedies is to come together and to share and to be open and honest with each other and to help each other kind of move through these emotions. The whole kind of underlying theme of this book is summed up in this quote where he says, "In reconciliation, we have all finally admitted to our failures. The opposite of fear is called honesty, and it's called trust, and it's called openness." He believes that in coming together and working together and loving each other, that is how reconciliation is best achieved. I'm not going to rate these books in this video because that feels a little weird, but they were all very good and I would not recommend them if I didn't enjoy them or think they were important. I'm gonna try and do this with the cat on my lap now. Up next, I have Becoming a Matriarch by Helen Knott. I talked about this book in my Magical Readathon wrap-up, so I will link that video and you can go check that out as well. But basically, this is another nonfiction book. This is a memoir, and it talks more about personal grief. There are still some aspects here that deal with the intergenerational trauma of the residential schools, of the cultural genocide that they caused, because she talks about the different kind of grieving rituals in her community that were lost and how that has affected her. In this book, Helen talks about losing her mom and her grandma within 6 months of each other, and how that affected her, how she tried to fill kind of their roles, find a new role in their family and society for herself, and just the grief and the way that that triggered her like past issues as well. And Helen is of Deneza, Nihio, Métis, and European descent. This is a very vulnerable and like intimate look into someone's grieving process, and it's just very beautifully written. Helen Knott writes absolutely gorgeous lines, and again, I have a ton of little like tabs in here, so I think this is just, even in general, like a really interesting book around grief, and I think she has a lot of even like just like broad ideas around grieving that I think are really helpful. The next book I want to recommend is One Story, One Song by Richard Wagamese, who is one of my favorite authors. He unfortunately is dead, but all of his books are absolutely excellent. And he is Ojibwe from the Wabanishmog Independent Nations. This is another nonfiction book. It's a series of essays that are based around the 4 cardinal directions and the 4 kind of core values in his culture, and kind of his like personal journey through these different values. So the 4 different values are humility, trust, introspection, and wisdom, and this chronicles kind of his journey to connect with his culture and heritage, because he had had that taken away from him and he was in the foster care system. And so it kind of talks in little bits and pieces. It's not very linear, but like it talks about different chunks of him rediscovering his heritage and connecting with those rituals and with people in his community. There are some pretty sad parts about his time in foster care. He was homeless for a while, he struggled with addiction, but there's also this real sense of hopefulness, of community and gratitude, and the way he talks about his wife Deb is so beautiful. You can just tell there's such genuine love and affection they have for each other, and that they had built a beautiful life together. And it just is like it feels like a very healing kind of book. Again, lots of tabs in it, and actually my copy is signed. I found it in a used bookshop and it was signed, and I was like, that's incredible. The next book I have to recommend to you is Truth Telling by Michelle Good. This was just published this year and is a series of 7 essays about Indigenous life in Canada. Michelle is Cree from the Red Pheasant Cree Nation. She has previously written a novel about Indigenous children in residential schools, which was absolutely excellent and heartbreaking, and I would highly recommend it. But this is nonfiction and is a very good kind of scope on the Indigenous situation in Canada and what it's like to be Indigenous in Canada. Some of it is her life, some of it is not. She talks about being part of the 60s scoop. So in the 1960s and beyond, there was a program in Canada where they took Indigenous children from their families and rehomed them with foster families, often white foster families, for a similar reason as they did put them in residential schools, again erasing the Indigenous cultures from existence, committing cultural genocide. This is the first book that I read that has been a first-hand account of the 60s scoop, and it was honestly just also very horrifying. She talks about the compensation that people got for the 60s scoop. So if you'd been a victim of it, you got $25,000, and she kind of did the math on it. So for example, she was in the system for 5 years in 6 different foster homes, and so that breaks down to $13.69 a day for going through this horrific ordeal while she was growing up, which is an insultingly little amount of money for the kind of trauma that she went through and that others went through in the 60s scoop. Furthermore, a lot of people spent 10 years in the system and everyone got the same $25,000 settlement. So that would work out to $6.85 a day. And even worse, if you were taken as a newborn and you spent the full 18 years in the system, the $25,000 settlement only worked out to $3.80 a day. So when broken down like that, it is really an insultingly small amount of money to compensate for the atrocities that were committed. She even says in the book, "How ironic that compensation intended to set things right becomes just another statement of how little value is placed on the lives of Indigenous children." And it's estimated that between the 50s and the 80s, there were 30 to 50,000 Indigenous children who were taken from their families and put in other homes. There was also in here pictures of advertisements in newsletters for Indigenous children as though they were some sort of product to be bought and sold, like puppies up for adoption. They had the little write-ups and everything. It's very dehumanizing and quite horrifying. I know I've said horrifying so many times, but it's really bad. There's also like social workers who would win salesperson of the year for taking and rehoming all these Indigenous children, and it's just such a sickening thing to have happened. And even though that's not a process anymore, as of 2016, 52.2% of children in foster care 14 or younger are Indigenous, whereas they only make up 7.7% of the population of children in general. They're in foster care at an extremely high rate compared to the proportion of the population that they actually make up. So I think that part, the part about the 60s scoop, was what really stuck with me, obviously, but she does talk about residential schools. She has a good kind of like breakdown of that as well. And then she talks about the land back movement. She talks about Indigenous writers. It's just like a really good kind of broad overview of different issues that Indigenous people are facing in Canada. So those are all the non-fiction books I want to recommend. I do also have a few fiction books that I would like to recommend as well. The first one being This House Is Not a Home by Katlia. This is also a signed edition, which is very fun. Katlia is a Dene woman from the Northwest Territories, and this is actually based on a true story of a family who went out hunting for several weeks and then came home and found that their house had been bulldozed because the white people thought that they had abandoned it. And so they lost their house and all their possessions and had to start over, and it's real bad. This is a fiction book. This follows a young man throughout the course of his life, from being young and being taken to a residential school to being able to come back home and working on reconnecting with the land and his culture and like living off the land, growing up, getting married, and really having to contend with wanting to live in his traditional way and the impositions of the white people as they're developing more and more and taking away land. And this one is a bit of a killer. It's very well written, it's very interesting, it touches on a lot of really important topics and talks a lot about the issues the Indigenous people face due to colonization. But like every time you think that he's like, okay, he's figured out a way to like live with what's going on, it's just like one thing after another coming for him. And it's tough. It feels almost like some sort of like fable, especially near the end. It has that kind of quality where you're going through such a big range of time, and it's a small book. It's only like 189 pages, so it's very small to cover a whole lifespan. Yeah, but it really feels kind of fable-like at times, and it's very good, and it's not like so depressing that you can't read it, but you just want this poor guy to be able to catch a break. And it's not till near the very end that he manages to be at peace, at least a little bit. Up next, I have Warrior Girl Unearthed by Angeline Boulley. I also talked about this in my Orilium wrap-up, so you can check out that review there as well. The author is Chippewa, and this follows Perry Firekeeper Birch, who discovers that some human remains and artifacts had been kept at a university that belonged to her community and her band, and so she is trying to find a way to get them back, and is realizing that the institutions that are in place make it so difficult to return these items to their proper communities, because, you know, the institutions make it so that it's easy for the universities and the museums and stuff to keep hold of them illegally and immorally. This is a YA novel, and it was really excellent. It has kind of a bit of a heist element in it. The author also talks about missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. So it talks about a lot of very heavy and important topics, but also has this kind of action vibe, and Perry is a very like determined and strong main character, and she's like angry and upset, and reasonably so. So she also has that like passion that is driving her through this whole book. The final book I have to recommend to you is To Shape a Dragon's Breath by Moniquill Blackgoose, who is an enrolled member of the Seekonk Wampanoag tribe. This is a fantasy book where there are dragons in the world, and our main character is an indigenous girl who finds a dragon egg, and her people have lost kind of the traditional ways of taking care of dragons and learning to shape their breath so that they do not catch everything on fire. So she ends up going to a school run by white people to learn how to control her dragon, basically, make sure it doesn't destroy everything. And so it has a lot of ideas around like the traditional indigenous way of doing things and the kind of more Western way of doing things and the clash between them, but also the loss of culture and the loss of knowledge. The school isn't quite a residential school, but it does have those vibes of like you have to be a certain way in order for things to be right, like you have to do things the right way, the way that the Western societies are doing it. There's a character in here who's indigenous but who was raised by white people in kind of a foster care situation. He feels a lot of shame around anything that makes him indigenous, doesn't have any knowledge around his culture or his community. There's also queer and poly characters in this, and it's just a very interesting framework for discussing all these different ideas around colonialism and different issues that indigenous communities face as well. Both of these books are from authors in the United States, but they do talk about issues that affect indigenous people everywhere. This was a very interesting book. It's going to be a series, so I am excited for the next one. And I think our main character is a very interesting kind of view in bridging the gap between the two, the like traditional ways and the newer ways, and her brother even more so. He's kind of embraced the new ways of doing things and struggles with his father, who wants to do things only the traditional way, and then our main character is kind of a little bit of a mix of both, of wanting to keep the old ways but maybe incorporate some of the new ways as well in a like balanced way. But yeah, as you can see, again, lots of tabs in this, a very different way of doing a dragon book, which I really enjoyed. Those are the selection of Indigenous books that I have to recommend to you in honor of the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, or even if you're just looking for books by Indigenous authors, these are all excellent. Thank you so much for watching this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I hope to see you next time. Now go read a book. And I haven't read Fourth Wing yet, but if you did and you didn't enjoy it, but you wanted a Dragon Academy book, maybe try this. This might be better. And he's still alive. I don't want to make it sound like he's dead. He's still alive.